The structure rising behind Asa Holloway's standard-issue company cabin looked like it was being skinned alive and coated in tar. In the thin, late-autumn light of the Coeur d'Alene Mountains, it was an offense against reason. Every other settler in the Silver Boom camp of 1891 was chinking their log walls tighter with moss and daub, preparing for the inevitable hammer of an Idaho winter. Asa was doing the opposite. He was slathering his cabin, inside and out, with a 4-inch thick layer of something black, gritty, and vaguely sinister. It was a mixture of crushed charcoal from the stamp mill's waste pile, gray river clay, and the stringy inner bast of cedar bark. He worked with a slow, rhythmic patience. A heavy tamp in his hands, he'd scoop a load of the dark mortar onto a hawk, press it against the logs, and pack it firm. The motion was punctuated by the sound of his own body, a heavy thump as he planted his good left foot, a soft drag as his right foot, the one with the nerve damage from a collapsed gallery years ago, slid into place. And then the wet, percussive tamp of the tool. Thump, drag, tamp, tamp. It was the only sound in the clearing, a slow heartbeat against the rising whisper of the wind in the pines. The men who walked the track up from the mine workings would stop and watch. Their opinions, formed on the assay office porch and spoken in the mingled tongues of a dozen different mining districts, were uniform in their judgment. "It's a fire trap," said Reese Morgan, the Cornish shift boss, a man who understood the physics of rock and timber. One hot ember from the stove, a little pocket of air in that charcoal, and he'll go up like a torch. Signora Bellucci, who ran the Italian boarding house and had seen 3 fires in her lifetime, was more concerned with the body. "That dust," she'd say, gesturing with a flour-coated hand, "it will get in the lungs. He'll give his brother the consumption for certain." The company doctor agreed, citing the dangers of coal dust, and the traveling circuit rider, a man who saw the world in stark contrasts, simply declared the black walls ungodly. A home was meant to be a place of light, not a cave of soot. Asa heard it all. He'd nod politely and return to his work. He never argued. He just kept mixing his mud and packing his walls, thump, drag, tamp, covering the cheerful yellow of the peeled logs with 4 inches of black, insulating defiance. No one understood that he wasn't building a wall against the cold. He was building a battery for heat, a repository of warmth for a man who could no longer see it. The question that hung in the sharp mountain air, unspoken but felt by all, was simple. Had Asa Holloway's time in the war finally unsettled his mind? Or had he stumbled upon a secret that would make a fool of them all? The story of how a man can see what others cannot is rarely simple. It often involves a journey through hardship, a willingness to listen to forgotten wisdom, and a deep, unshakable purpose. If you stay with me, I promise you will understand the profound physics of porous thermal mass, a principle that can turn a wall from a sieve that leaks heat into a sponge that holds it. We explore these forgotten technologies because they teach us not just how to build, but how to think. If you find value in that exploration, consider subscribing to this channel and sharing your own thoughts in the comments below. What's the strangest building material you've ever seen work? Asa Holloway was not a carpenter, nor was he a frontiersman by training. Before the war, he was a farm boy from the flat, fertile lands along the Wabash River in Indiana. His hands knew the heft of a seed sack and the smooth handle of a plow, not the bite of an adze or the precise geometry of a timber frame. What changed him, what remade his understanding of the earth itself, was his time as a Union Army sapper in Virginia from 1863 to 1865. A sapper's trade is the earth. He digs, he tunnels, he builds fortifications. His enemy is not just the opposing army, but the cold, the wet, and the sheer physical instability of the ground beneath his feet. In the long, miserable winters of the Siege of Petersburg, Asa learned a peculiar kind of battlefield alchemy, The engineers had discovered that revetments, the earthen walls of trenches and batteries, could be made to hold a surprising amount of warmth. The standard practice was to tamp earth, but a few forward-thinking officers experimented with mixing crushed charcoal from the cook fires and forges with clay. The resulting composite wall, tamped hard, did something miraculous. On a bitter January night, a soldier could lean against the interior face of a charcoal clay revetment and feel a distinct, if faint, lack of chill. The ground wasn't warm, precisely, but it wasn't stealing his body heat with the same vicious efficiency as plain, damp earth. The charcoal, it seemed, held the day's meager sunlight and the fire's radiant glow long into the night. It was a soldier's trick, a small comfort in a world of misery, and Asa filed it away. It was in one of those trenches that his life changed again. A Confederate mortar shell struck nearby, collapsing a forward gallery he was shoring up. The weight of timber and earth crushed his right leg, leaving him with a permanent slight drag in his step. It was this injury that gave his work its distinctive rhythm, a physical memory of the war that he unconsciously timed his hammer strokes to. He was a man marked by the earth, who understood its properties in a way a surface dweller never could. After the war, he drifted west, working railroads and then mines, his knowledge of geology and timbering finding a new, more profitable application. He followed the Silver Rush to the Coeur d'Alene district, a jagged spine of mountains in the Idaho Territory. He sent for his sister and her husband, Henri, a cheerful Quebecois millwright. For a year, life was good. Then, last spring, a blasting cap misfired at the stamp mill. A flash of intense, white-hot powder left Henri completely and permanently blind. His sister, overwhelmed, returned east with their young children, but Asa would not let Henri go with her. "He knows this place," Asa had said, a quiet finality in his voice. "He stays with me." So Asa took him in, and the focus of his life narrowed to a single, sharp point, caring for a man plunged into a world of total darkness, a world defined only by sound, touch, and temperature. That first winter in the company cabin was a lesson in thermal failure, and it was during that brutal season that Asa's past as a sapper connected with a piece of much older knowledge. He had become friendly with Silas Kamiakin, a Shitsuumsh elder who sometimes came down from the high country to the Cataldo Mission Flats. Silas was a quiet, watchful man who saw more with his eyes than most men saw with a surveyor's transit. One afternoon, watching Asa split yet another round of lodgepole pine for the insatiable stove, Silas made a simple observation. He pointed with his chin at the cabin. "Breathes out all its warmth," he said. Asa, frustrated and tired, asked him how his people survived the deep cold in their mat lodges. For an answer, Silas took a stick and drew in the ash near the woodpile. He sketched the conical shape of a lodge, then drew a thick, heavy bank around its base. He explained that in the old days, they would bank the lodges with a mix of earth and the charcoal dust from long dead fires. The charcoal-earth mixture didn't just block the wind, it drank the heat from the central fire pit and held it. "The embers die," Silas said, tapping the drawing of the banked wall, "but the earth remembers the fire until morning." In that moment, two worlds clicked into place in Asa's mind. The charcoal-clay revetments of a Virginia trench and the banked winter lodges of the Shitsuumsh people. It was the same principle, applied across a continent and 1,000 years of experience. The army had used it to keep soldiers from freezing. Silas's people had used it to keep families alive. Asa now had a new purpose for it, to build a cabin that could hold warmth for a man who could only feel it. The conventional log cabin of the American frontier was a brilliant solution to a specific problem: how to build a sturdy, weatherproof shelter quickly, using only the materials at hand. It was a marvel of folk engineering, but it had a fundamental, inescapable flaw. It was a thermal catastrophe. The problem wasn't a single failure, but a conspiracy of them, a perfect system for wasting heat. That first winter, Asa and Henri learned this lesson in their bones. The company cabin was well built by local standards: 12-inch peeled lodgepole pine, saddle-notched corners, a tight planked roof, yet it bled warmth like a sieve bleeds water. By November, the stove, a small cast-iron box stove, had to be fed almost constantly. The iron would glow a dull cherry red, radiating a fierce heat that was brutally effective within a 6-foot radius. Anyone sitting outside that circle might as well have been outdoors. Henri, whose senses were now acutely tuned to the environment, became a living thermometer. He would spend his days huddled on a stool next to the stove, his hands outstretched. "Asa," he'd say, his voice quiet, "the far wall is breathing cold again." Asa would look over and see a fine, crystalline web of frost painting the inside of the logs 60 feet from the fire. The ink bottle on the small shelf where Asa wrote letters froze solid. Water in the bucket by the door developed a thick crust of ice overnight. They slept in their coats, under every blanket they owned. The cabin consumed firewood at a terrifying rate. A standard cord of wood, a tightly stacked pile 8 feet long, 4 feet high, and 4 feet wide, was supposed to last a frugal family a month or more. Theirs vanished in 8 days. The constant work of felling, bucking, splitting, and hauling wood left Asa exhausted, his evenings spent not in rest, but in preparation for the next day's battle against the cold. The physics of the failure were relentless. First, there was conduction. A solid log, for all its bulk, is a poor insulator. Heat from the stove warmed the indoor air, which warmed the inner surface of the logs. That thermal energy then traveled directly through the solid wood to the outside, where the frigid mountain air whisked it away. The R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of a solid pine log is only about 1.25 per inch. A 12-inch log wall, therefore, had an R value of roughly R15, but this was deceptive. The chinking between the logs was often less effective, creating cold stripes up the walls. Second, there was the problem of thermal mass. A log cabin has a great deal of mass, but it's the wrong kind. The dense wood could absorb a lot of heat, but because it was also a decent conductor, it lost that heat to the outside almost as fast as it absorbed it from the inside. The walls never truly charged with warmth. As soon as the fire died down, the stored heat in the logs would rush outwards, and the interior temperature would plummet. Finally, there was air infiltration. Though Asa had chinked the cabin as well as any man, the seasonal expansion and contraction of the logs created 1,000 tiny, invisible gaps. Cold, dense mountain air would push its way in, while warm, buoyant interior air would escape through the roof and upper walls. You could feel it as a constant, subtle draft, a cold current that slithered across the floor and chilled the room from the bottom up. The neighbors faced the same struggle. The entire camp was a collection of superheated stoves surrounded by zones of Arctic cold. Families burned through 12 or 15 cords of wood in a single winter. It was the accepted reality of the place, a hardship to be endured. But Asa, watching his blind brother-in-law shiver in the supposed comfort of his own home, refused to accept it. He knew there had to be a way to make the walls work for them, not against them. He needed a wall that didn't just block the cold, but held the heat. He needed the wall he had learned to build twice, once in a war and once in a conversation over a drawing in the ash. The work began in September as the aspens on the high ridges were turning a brilliant, fiery yellow. The first task was gathering the materials, an act of scavenging and labor. The charcoal was the easiest. The stamp mill, which crushed the silver ore, used a steam engine fired by wood. The resulting charcoal waste was dumped in a massive, ever-growing pile. It was considered useless, a nuisance, Asa got permission to take all he wanted. He spent days hauling it by wheelbarrow, sack by dusty sack, to his cabin site. He then crushed it further with a heavy wooden mallet, breaking it down into a coarse, gravel-like consistency. Nothing larger than a thumbnail. The clay came from the riverbank, a seam of fine gray plastic clay hidden 2 feet below the topsoil. This was back-breaking work. He dug pits, loading the dense, heavy clay into sacks and hauling them up the slope. He needed tons of it, enough to create a 4-inch layer over every square foot of his cabin's walls, inside and out. The binder was cedar bast, the stringy, fibrous inner bark of the western red cedar. He stripped it from fallen trees, then soaked it in a trough of water until it became pliable. He then pounded it with a mallet, separating the fibers until he had a pile of what looked like coarse, damp twine. The mixing was done in a shallow pit lined with planks. He'd shovel in the clay, add water, and work it with a hoe and his own boots until it was a thick, consistent slurry. Then came the charcoal, shoveled in until the mixture was about 60% charcoal by volume. Finally, he'd stir in the cedar bast, which would act like a kind of primitive rebar, holding the render together as it dried and preventing it from cracking. The final product was a thick, black, gritty mortar that clung heavily to the shovel. Then came the application. He started on the inside, with Henri sitting near the cold stove, providing a quiet, still point of reference. Asa began to coat the walls. He'd press the mixture into the gaps between the logs first, creating a smooth, monolithic surface. Then he began to build up the thickness, layer by layer, letting each one firm up slightly before adding the next. This was when the community's opposition became most vocal. Reese Morgan, the shift boss, stopped by on his way home. "Asa, I've seen this before," he said, his Cornish accent thick. "In Butte, a boarding house. They had a charred sill near the stovepipe. It smoldered for 2 days, nobody knew. Then one night, poof, the whole place went up. You're building a wall of kindling." "The charcoal is encased in the clay, Reese," Asa said calmly, not pausing in his work. "There's no air to be had." Morgan just shook his head and walked away. A few days later, Signora Bellucci brought them a loaf of bread. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, at the dark, damp interior. "Asa, this is not healthy. The dampness will bring sickness. And the black, it is a sad color for a home. It will sadden the soul." "It will be dry before the first snow, Signora," he replied, "and Henri does not see the color." The most significant moment of the build came on a bright, crisp October afternoon. Asa was working on the south wall, the sun warming his back. His rhythm was steady, thump, drag, tamp, thump, drag, tamp. He was so lost in the work, he didn't notice 2 figures approaching. It was Silas Kamiakin, and he was watching from the cabin step. Asa continued his work, packing the dark render with a practiced economy of motion. Silas watched the ratio of charcoal to clay as Asa mixed a new batch. He watched the thickness Asa was building on the wall. He watched the steady, patient rhythm of the work. After a long silence, he gave a single, slow nod of approval and left as quietly as he had arrived. Inside, Henri was conducting his own inspection. He would stand and run his palm flat against the drying wall. His sense of touch, now incredibly refined, could detect the slightest variations. "A little thin here by the window frame," he would say, or, "This section feels right, Asa, solid." He was reading the house by feel, his hands becoming the quality inspector, ensuring the thermal battery was being built to the right specification. His involvement transformed the project. It wasn't just Asa's idea anymore. It was their shared defense, a wall they were building together, each with the senses he had left. As the last section of render was tamped into place in early November, the cabin was transformed. It was no longer a log structure. It was a monolithic black sculpture, waiting for the cold. To understand why Asa Holloway's black cabin worked, you have to understand a principle that modern building science has only recently begun to fully appreciate: the difference between insulation and thermal mass. Most people think of them as the same thing, but they are fundamentally different forces in the fight against cold. Asa's genius was in combining them. Insulation is about resistance. Its primary job is to slow the transfer of heat. Materials with lots of tiny, trapped air pockets, like wool, sawdust, or modern fiberglass, are good insulators. Air itself is a terrible conductor of heat, so trapping it in small pockets creates a barrier. The R value of a material measures its resistance to heat flow. A standard log wall, as we've seen, might have an R value of R15. This is resistance, but it's a passive defense. Thermal mass, on the other hand, is about storage. It's a material's ability to absorb, store, and later release thermal energy. Dense, heavy materials, like stone, concrete, or packed earth have high thermal mass. A massive object takes a long time to heat up, and once it's hot, it takes a long time to cool down. Think of a large stone placed near a campfire. Long after the fire has died to embers, the stone will continue to radiate a gentle warmth. It has become a heat battery. A conventional log cabin fails because it gets the balance wrong. It has some thermal mass from the heavy logs, but not enough insulation. The heat it absorbs from the stove is conducted too quickly to the outside world. It's like trying to fill a bucket that has a large hole in the bottom. Asa's charcoal clay render completely changed this equation. He had created a material that possessed both high insulation and high thermal mass. This is the holy grail of passive building design. Let's break down the physics. The crushed charcoal was the key to its insulating properties. Charcoal is incredibly porous. It's basically a carbon sponge filled with millions of microscopic air pockets. When Asa mixed this with the clay, he was creating a composite material filled with trapped, still air. The clay acted as the matrix, holding the charcoal particles apart and encasing them, preventing air from moving between the pockets. This created a remarkable insulator. Modern tests on similar materials show an R value of up to R4 per inch. With a 4-inch layer inside and another 4 inches outside, Asa had added a staggering R32 of insulation to his R15 walls, bringing the total to an unheard-of R47. But it was more than just insulation. The total weight of the render he applied to the cabin was nearly 12 tons. That is an enormous amount of thermal mass. This mass, protected by its own insulating properties, became a massive, slow-reacting heat sponge. Here's how it worked over a 24-hour cycle. During the day and evening, Asa would run the stove. The heat radiated from the stove wouldn't just heat the air in the cabin. It would slowly, steadily soak into the 4-inch layer of charcoal clay on the interior walls. It took hours for the thermal energy to penetrate deep into the dense black render. Asa was literally charging the walls with British thermal units, or BTUs. Then, at night, when he banked the stove and the fire died down, the magic happened. In a normal cabin, the temperature would immediately begin to crash as heat escaped through the walls. But in Asa's cabin, the flow of energy reversed. As the air temperature in the room began to drop, the supercharged interior walls, now warmer than the air, began to release their stored heat back into the living space. They radiated a gentle, even warmth all night long. The cabin was no longer heated by the stove alone. It was heated by its own walls. The physics term for this is thermal lag. Asa's walls had a calculated lag time of 7 to 9 hours. This meant it took that long for a temperature change on one side of the render to be felt on the other. The intense cold of a sub-zero night simply couldn't penetrate the wall before the sun rose, and the stove was lit again, beginning the charging cycle anew. He had built a thermal flywheel, smoothing out the wild temperature swings between a roaring fire and a dead stove. He had defeated the winter not by fighting it with more fire, but by absorbing its energy and releasing it on his own terms. The winter of 1891 arrived not with a blizzard, but with a silent, suffocating cold. A mass of Arctic air, dense and heavy, settled over the Bitterroot Mountains. It met a stream of moist Pacific air, and the result was a week of heavy, freezing rime fog. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero and stayed there day after day, sometimes dipping to 30 below at night. There was no wind, just a profound, penetrating chill that seemed to leach the life out of everything. The fog coated every surface, trees, rooftops, railings, with a thick, feathery crust of ice crystals. The world turned white and silent. For the rest of the mining camp, it was a period of intense misery. The voracious appetite of their stoves doubled. The sound of axes splitting wood echoed constantly through the fog-dampened air. In the bunkhouses, men slept in shifts, one man always awake to feed the fire. Even so, the cold was winning. Tools left near the walls became too cold to touch with bare hands. Water froze just a few feet from the stove. Condensation from breath and cooking would freeze on the interior walls, coating them in a slick, icy glaze. Life shrank to the small circle of heat thrown by the fire. At Asa Holloway's cabin, life continued with an almost unnerving normalcy. The first true test came on the third morning of the cold snap. The outdoor temperature was -26. Asa woke at dawn, as always. The stove was cold, nothing but gray ash from the single log he had banked the night before. In any other cabin, the air would have been painfully cold, the temperature inside having plummeted to near freezing. But here the air was just cool. Not warm, but not cold. The thermometer on the shelf read 56 degrees. The ultimate proof rested on a small wooden crate next to the door, the coldest part of the cabin. On it sat a bar of tallow soap. In every other dwelling on the ridge, a bar of soap would be frozen solid, as hard as a rock. A man trying to shave would have to chip off brittle curls with his knife. Asa picked up the bar. It was firm, but pliable. He could press his thumb into it, leaving a slight indentation. The fat had not frozen. This small, mundane fact was more eloquent than any thermometer. It spoke of a baseline of warmth that no other cabin possessed. Henry was the living proof. He was no longer tethered to the stove. He moved freely about the small cabin, his hands occasionally brushing against the interior walls. "The wall feels like a sleeping dog, Asa," he said one afternoon. "Not hot, just alive." He could sit at the small table by the window, the glass thick with frost on the outside, and work at braiding a leather strap without his fingers growing numb. They ate their meals at the table, not huddled by the fire. The cabin had become a sanctuary of stable, ambient warmth, not a place of thermal extremes. They were burning a third of a cord of wood a week. The single pile he had stacked in October, which his neighbors predicted would be gone by Christmas, looked barely touched. He was saving hours of labor every day, labor he could now devote to other tasks. The black cabin, the object of so much ridicule and concern, was performing exactly as he and Silas had known it would. It was a quiet, functioning miracle in the heart of a frozen world. Vindication did not arrive with a knock on the door or a sudden public admission of error. It came quietly in small, disconnected observations that slowly accumulated into an undeniable truth. The community's skepticism didn't shatter. It simply dissolved in the face of impossible facts. The first witness was a Finn miner named Ano, a quiet man known for his skill with double jacking. He came by one morning during the worst of the cold, ostensibly to borrow some coffee, until the company store opened. Asa invited him in. Ano stepped across the threshold and stopped. his face a mask of confusion. He had just come from his bunkhouse, a place where the air was a sharp mixture of scorching heat near the stove and biting cold everywhere else. Here the air was uniformly, impossibly pleasant. Asa offered him a seat while he got the coffee. Henri, hearing the visitor, got up from his chair to fetch another cup from the shelf. Ano watched, transfixed, as the blind man navigated the cabin. Henri didn't shuffle or feel his way along. He walked with a quiet confidence. His left hand trailed lightly along the wall, then stopped. He reached up, his hand finding the edge of the shelf unerringly. He slid his fingers along it for a moment, then picked up a tin cup. He had located it by the subtle warmth line radiating from the wall where the shelf was mounted. The walls, charged with heat, had become a tactile map. Ano saw this. He took his coffee, said nothing about what he had witnessed, and left. But the image of a blind man reading the architecture of his home by temperature alone was seared into his mind. 2 days later, one of the Italian masons came by to ask Asa's help with a damaged winch. He too stepped inside and felt the same disorienting lack of suffering. He saw Henri sitting at the table calmly sorting beans for their supper, his hands nimble and relaxed. In the Italian's own dwelling, such a task was impossible away from the stove. A man's fingers would be too stiff with cold in minutes. He too left without comment, but with a deep, furrowed brow of recalculation. The stories began to trickle back to the assay porch, the camp's informal clearinghouse for news and opinion. They were not grand pronouncements, but quiet, factual reports. The blind man moves around in there like he can see. There's no frost on his walls. Holloway's woodpile hasn't shrunk in a week. Reese Morgan, the Cornish boss, who had been so certain it was a fire trap, heard these reports and walked up to the cabin himself. He made up an excuse about checking the roofline for snow load. Asa let him in. Morgan's eyes darted around the room, taking in the impossible details. The pliable bar of soap, the absence of huddling, the sheer, peaceful normalcy of the space. He looked at the black walls, expecting to see cracks or signs of soot. He saw only a solid, dark, stable surface. He looked at Henri, who was humming a tune as he mended a harness. Morgan's certainty was a hard, crystalline thing, formed over a lifetime of experience in mines and camps. But what he was seeing was a physical observation that could not exist if his certainty was correct. He had expected a fire trap, or at the very least a miserable, damp cave. He found a sanctuary. He stayed for 5 minutes, spoke about the snow, and left. He never mentioned the black walls again. And because he was the shift boss, the man whose opinion on practical matters carried the most weight, his silence echoed louder than his previous warnings. The talk on the assay porch simply ceased. There was no apology, no ceremony. The black cabin was no longer Holloway's folly, it just was. The narrator might have said it best. The black walls had become a blind man's map. The ultimate proof was not in the warmth you could feel, but in the life you could live inside it. The silent vindication during the deep cold of winter blossomed into quiet imitation with the spring thaw. The first to adopt the method were, unsurprisingly, the Finns and the Quebecois. They were men from cold climates, with a deep cultural memory of thermal efficiency and a healthy skepticism for the conventional wisdom of others. They had seen the proof with their own eyes. Ano, the miner who had witnessed Henri navigate by the warm walls, was the first. In April, as the snow began to recede, he approached Asa, not with questions about theory, but with a request for ratios. "The clay," he asked. "How much water? How much charcoal?" Asa, sitting on his porch mending a tool handle, explained the process simply and without any sense of holding a secret. He told Ano where to find the best clay seam and how to judge the mix by its feel. Within a week, Aino and 3 of his bunkhouse mates were coating their own small cabin with the black render. They were followed by 2 Quebecois families who lived on the far side of the camp. They had seen the plume of smoke from Asa's chimney, a thin, lazy wisp compared to the thick, churning columns rising from every other roof, and understood what it meant in the universal language of fuel consumption. By the end of May, 4 other cabins in the settlement were sporting the same dark, monolithic shell. There were no articles written, no lectures given. The knowledge spread the way all practical frontier knowledge did, through observation, imitation, and quiet, direct conversation. The most significant moment of adoption came in June. Mr. Egan, the housing inspector for the mining company, arrived at Asa's cabin. He was a man of checklists and regulations, an agent of an Eastern company that valued standardization above all else. He walked around the cabin, rapping his knuckles on the hard, dry render. He entered and felt the air, cool and pleasant in the summer heat. The massive walls now acting as a heat sink, pulling warmth out of the interior. He saw the still large woodpile, a testament to the winter's efficiency. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Holloway," he said, pulling out a notebook. "The company is planning to build a new bunkhouse and 3 family dwellings this summer. Give me the ratio for that mud of yours." It was not a request. It was a recognition of a new standard. Asa Holloway, the quiet eccentric, had become the author of the company's new best practice. His method, born of military necessity, refined by indigenous wisdom, and perfected for the love of his brother, was now becoming the official solution. The principles behind Asa Holloway's charcoal clay render are not a historical curiosity. They are foundational to modern high-performance building. His technique of combining insulation and thermal mass in a single monolithic wall is the direct ancestor of systems like insulated concrete forms, or ICFs, where foam insulation creates a mold for a solid concrete core. The goal is the same: to create a structure with a high R value and a massive heat-storing core. Today we call it a thermal battery, but the concept Silas Kamiakin drew in the ash is identical. Asa Holloway was a sapper, a man trained to build walls, to protect soldiers from the violence of war. In the quiet mountains of Idaho, he used that skill, deepened by the wisdom of a man whose people had understood the earth for much longer, for a different purpose. He built a wall not to keep an enemy out, but to hold a family in. For his brother Henri, who could no longer see the world, Asa built a home that could be felt. The walls weren't just a structure, they were a sensory organ, a map of warmth and safety in a world of darkness. It reminds us that the most profound innovations are often born not from a desire for mere efficiency, but from an act of care. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and compassion valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these methods in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.